All right, so the NBA offseason is officially off and running. And what better way to ring in the offseason than to talk about some of the worst offseason decisions we've seen teams make over the last couple of years? Bleacher Report just put out an article where they break down some of the worst contracts over the last 5 years. And what I'm going to do this video is react to each of those contract signings. And there are two different ways to look at it, right? There's one way of looking at it where you're like, yeah, in hindsight, right? Over the years, that contract looked bad, but at the time, it made sense for the team to make that decision to sign that guy to that amount of money over X amount of years at that particular point in time, right? There's that situation where you're like, yeah, I get it. It didn't turn out well, but I can see why they broke the bank for him. And there are other situations where you're like, we knew from day one this was a bad contract, and it proved that it was a bad contract over the course of time. So there are two different ways of looking at it, and you're going to see here through these names that I'm going to list off here, those two different types of situations. So let's start off with the first name, or one of the first names that they list, and that is Jordan Poole. All right, so this is a big one. So back in 2022, obviously, he signed a 4-year, $140 million contract with the Warriors. So this is one of those situations where at that time, it made sense for Golden State to pay him that much money. He averaged 18 points during the regular season and 17 points during the playoffs on efficient shooting, and was a key piece to a championship team. So it made a ton of sense for Golden State to make that investment at that point in time. His role was to be like this complementary piece to Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, and Draymond Green. And obviously, there was a lot of internal conflicts with the team. We know about the situation between him and Draymond, and that resulted in him getting traded to the Wizards. And as we saw, his first season with the Wizards was not good at all. Now, the only thing about him being on this list is that he still has time, right? It was just one really bad year with the Wizards where he was expected to be this really good all-star caliber player, like borderline all-star caliber guy. He didn't live up to those expectations, but it's not over yet. So I don't think it's fair just yet to say this Jordan Poole contract was a bad one. Like I said, at the time, it made sense. He just hasn't lived up to it just yet, but there is still time. So I'll hold off on the Jordan Poole thing. I'm not the biggest fan of him as a player, but he still has time to prove he's worth that amount of money. So that is the first one they list off here. Another one they list off is Bradley Beal. So in 2022, the Wizards signed him to a $251 million contract. So thing about Bradley Beal is this: as far as his on the court play, he is worth that money. At that point in time, he was one of the most dynamic scorers in the league during his time in Washington. He had 2 30-point per game seasons, but it was a tough investment to make because generally he has not been the healthiest guy. And we look at the first 2 years on that contract extension, he only played, or he missed at least 29 games. Right. So that's a lengthy amount of time to miss games. And it's only looking bad because he's generally been known as an injured guy. He's generally been known as a guy who struggled from an availability standpoint. As far as his on the court play, I can't say he's not worth that money. But again, it's the point that he's consistently hurt. Right. And then also, if you look at how he played with Phoenix this year, didn't look good at all. Didn't look like as a player he was worth that money. But again, availability was his biggest issue. He wasn't able to get in any consistent rhythm here in Phoenix. So this isn't one where I look at it and I'm like, yeah, as a player, he's not worth that money. Brad Beal has always been one of the best scorers in the league in his best ways, but when he's playing at his best. But as far as the injuries and his availability, I can see why now this is seen as a bad contract, and it's a little burdensome for the Suns. But he does have time over the next couple of years to try to clean it up, especially next season. So we'll end up seeing what happens. So again, kind of like Jordan Poole, yes, now it's a disappointment, but there's still time for him to get it right. But the way things stand, because he hasn't been super available, whenever you have a guy who's injured consistently like this, those contracts always look bad. But like I said, he still has time to get things right. Another one, very interesting, very underrated one, was Evan Fournier. So he had a really, really solid season with the Celtics in the 2020-2021 season. The Knicks brought him in the next year on a $73 million contract. And his first year was solid with the Knicks in 2022. He averaged 14 points on efficient splits. The Knicks missed the playoffs after surprising everyone and making the playoffs for the first time since 2013. The previous year, there were a bunch of internal issues. He wasn't really meshing with Tom Thibodeau and became a lower priority offensively, especially once Jalen Brunson signed in that 2022 2023 season, and his minutes dwindled from like 30 minutes per game to 17 per game. So Thibodeau pretty much stopped using him as much. We saw Thibodeau also do that with a couple of other guys. Kemba Walker is another example of that. So Evan Fournier was on a pretty fairly large contract, right? Not too large, but he was on a contract that was bigger than what he delivered to New York as far as playing goes. And obviously, they traded him at the deadline last year, and here he is with Detroit. And that didn't go well either, right? For one, if you trade over to Detroit, who was a team that just was really, really bad this previous season, it's not a good sign. And when he was there, just didn't play well. He only averaged 18 minutes per game and only 32 games in total on the season. So rough stuff here for Fournier after he had a lot of expectations as like maybe like a secondary or third option shot creator. Just didn't get to play that role consistently because of his issues with the Knicks. And that's kind of where or why he is where he's at now. So rough stuff there for Fournier, who I thought could have been a good contributor to a really good playoff team, but things just did not work out. Next one, this is one for my Philly fans, and that is Tobias Harris. 5 years, $180 million. It looks like the Sixers are not going to re-sign him this offseason. I can understand why. Thing about Tobias Harris is this. I love him as a player, efficient, known as a really efficient guy, can knock down shots off the catch, can be a solid defender. Why things look bad now? The Sixers paid him the money and expected him to be a really good kind of game takeover guy, right? That's why he's there. He's there to complement Joel Embiid. At the time, he was there to complement both Embiid and Ben Simmons. They needed really good shot creation from the perimeter, and he was looked at as that guy. People thought he was going to make an all-star level leap in Philly. While his numbers were efficient, while his numbers did look good, he was scoring like in the high double figures on good splits. He never took that leap into being like a takeover, a game takeover guy for the Sixers. And that's why it's looked at as a disappointment. He never got out of that top tier role player type of role and never elevated his game to like all-star status. That's why it's disappointing. And obviously how things ended last 2 years have been his worst years since being in Orlando. And also averaged only 9 points through the postseason in that first round. Just very disappointing. Had a horrible first round against the Knicks, and that's why Sixers fans and the Sixers themselves are ready to move on. Rough stuff. Again, he's one of those guys who I feel like they expected him to play a larger role than what he was optimized at. Like there are a lot of dudes who can average 25 points a game if given the opportunity, right? But is that where they're most optimized? No. And I think they played Tobias Harris in a role or tried to play him in a role where he wasn't the most optimized. I think where he's at his best is kind of being like a 3-and-D threat. I think that's where Tobias Harris is at his absolute best, where he's most optimized at, and they never really utilized him there, or even they did after realizing he's not who we expected him to be. I like him as a player, but he didn't become the guy they needed him to become to get over the hump. So that's why he's here on this list. Finally, another one here for my Sixers fans. This one is the absolute worst. No further ado, Ben Simmons. 5 years, $170 million, signed in 2019. At that time, 100% deserving of it. All-star player, ridiculous upside, one of the best defenders in the entire league. Elite playmaker. Even if he didn't have a jump shot, the upside, like I mentioned, was as high as any player we've ever seen. He got the money. He had a couple of years where it looked really, really good, and he was an all-star. Then that 2021 season happened. He just never developed his offensive game. He never became a scoring threat, never became a threat really in the half court, and he just stayed stagnant. And it was really apparent in 2021 in that first round against the Hawks where he famously missed up or passed up on that dunk, passed it off, and that just ended up turning into absolute turmoil for the 76ers. And from there, he ain't been the same. There was the fallout with the team. Then there were injuries. He got over to Brooklyn, has barely played a game there, has barely played any games there in Brooklyn. And right now, it's just all looking like a wash. This is the most disappointing one because Ben Simmons, again, was worth that money at that point in time. Looked like he was going to get to that superstar level. And I would say because it's his own fault he didn't get there. We can talk about injuries, but the fact that he never truly added anything to his game over time, that's where you kind of point the finger at him, right? Like Tobias Harris was good. He just wasn't ready to play that particular role, right? He just wasn't optimizing that particular role. With, the other guys mentioned here in this trade, when we're talking about Jordan Poole, he still has time to get it figured out. Bradley Beal, it was injuries, right? With Simmons, he had it and then he lost it because of him. Simple as that. And right now, there just doesn't look like any upside. It just looks like Simmons is going to kind of fall out of basketball. The way things are looking now, it looks like a total Andrew Bynum-esque situation where this guy just kind of goes missing, makes a couple of appearances after being a really, really good player, and just never gets back to where he was at. Right now, I just don't see the upside in Ben Simmons' career. Would I like to see it? Absolutely, but it's just not there. So this is the most disappointing one here on this list. Expectations were there. They were very warranted, right? People weren't wrong to think he would turn into that type of player. The Sixers weren't wrong to make that investment. He just did not live up to it because he did not add to his game. So those are the five probably worst contract situations over the last couple of years. There's some other ones sprinkled in there. Davis Bertans with the Golden State, or excuse me, with the Washington Wizards was a pretty rough one. But let's hope this offseason we don't have any of those types of situations. And let's also hope, especially with guys like Beal and Jordan Poole and hell, even Ben Simmons, they can turn the narrative around and get things right, especially Simmons. There's nothing I want to see more than Ben Simmons get back to that level, but I just don't see it happening. So we'll see what happens in this offseason, and we'll see what ends up happening next season. But hopefully some of these guys can redeem themselves going into the 2024-2025 season.